The night before the hanging settled over Red Willow like a held breath, heavy and close, the kind of darkness that pressed against the skin and made even the bravest men uneasy. And inside the narrow wooden cell beneath the courthouse sat Jonah Crow, hands unbound for the first time in years, listening to the wind slide through the gallows outside as if it were practicing his name. Jonah Crow, the outlaw everyone claimed to know, the killer, the thief, the blood-soaked legend. Though as he sat alone on the cold bench with a single lantern burning low, he felt more like a tired man at the end of a long road than the monster painted on wanted posters, and it was there, in that quiet hour between midnight and dawn, when the world felt thin and close to breaking, that Jonah began to speak, not loudly, not to anyone in particular, but to the shadows, to the dust, to the memory of a life that had been shaped more by loss than by violence, his voice rough and slow as he confessed truths he had buried deeper than any stolen gold, truths no one had ever asked for and no one had ever cared to hear, because legends were easier than understanding, and understanding had never fed a hungry boy or buried a dead mother. He spoke of the night his name first turned dark, not the shootout the papers loved to print, but a winter evening years earlier when he had stood barefoot in the snow outside a burned-down shack, holding his younger sister Lucy as she shivered and cried, their father already gone to drink and never return, their mother taken by fever while the town doctor refused to ride out that far for people who couldn't pay, and Jonah admitted, with a slow shake of his head, that something inside him had broken then, not with anger but with a hollow certainty that the world had rules and mercy wasn't one of them, and he confessed that every crime after had been less about greed and more about survival, about refusing to kneel in a land that only noticed you when you bled, and as the lantern flickered he spoke of faces that haunted him, not the men he had shot in fair fights, but the ones he couldn't save, like the ranch hand pinned under a collapsing beam, like the young deputy who had tried to talk instead of draw, and Jonah's voice softened when he spoke of her, because there was always a her behind every man's downfall, though no one ever bothered to ask, and he said her name only once, quietly, as if afraid it might vanish if spoken too loudly. Mara Bell, a schoolteacher with ink-stained fingers and eyes that saw through the dust and noise straight to the bone of a person, and Jonah confessed that the night he rode into Willow Creek wounded and half-starved, it was Mara who hid him in the empty schoolhouse, who cleaned his blood without asking what he had done, who listened as he spoke not of crimes but of dreams he no longer believed in. And in the dim cell Jonah admitted the truth that would never make it into songs or sermons, that he had wanted to stop then, to leave the gun behind and learn how to be a man whose hands built instead of destroyed, and for a short, fragile season he had, working dawn to dusk under another name, watching Mara laugh with the children, sitting with her on the schoolhouse steps as the sun fell soft and red across the plains, a peace so unfamiliar it frightened him more than any posse ever had. But peace, he said, was a dangerous thing for men like him, because it gave you something to lose. And when the law finally caught his trail and rode into town with badges bright and intentions darker, Jonah had run not to save himself but to draw them away from Mara, committing one last crime so loud and reckless it erased every quiet good deed he had ever done, and he confessed that the blood spilled that night, the one that sealed his fate, had been spilled so others could sleep, though no one would ever write it that way. And as the wind outside moaned through the gallows, Jonah leaned back against the wall, exhaustion heavy in his bones, and spoke of fear, not of death, but of being remembered wrong, of becoming nothing more than a warning whispered to children, and his confession grew more intimate then, less about what he had done and more about what he had felt, the loneliness of endless roads, the way silence could scream louder than gunfire, the shame of surviving when better men had not, and he admitted that every time he took a life, a part of him hoped it would be the last, hoped the next bullet might finally let him rest, because living with the weight of remembered faces was its own kind of sentence. And Jonah paused, breathing slow, the lantern light carving deep shadows across his face, and said the secret then, the one thing no one knew and no court had ever heard, that the final robbery blamed on him, the one that made him infamous beyond forgiveness, had never been his at all, that he had taken the blame because the real men were boys barely grown, scared and foolish, and Jonah, already tired of running, had stepped forward into the legend like a man stepping into cold water, knowing it would swallow him whole but believing, in some quiet stubborn way, that sparing them might tilt the world a fraction closer to fairness. And as the night stretched thin he spoke less and listened more, to the creak of rope outside, to the distant bark of a dog, to his own heartbeat steady and calm, and there was a strange tenderness in him then, a softness earned only by those who have nothing left to defend. And Jonah Crow, outlaw, murderer, myth, confessed not to seek mercy but to leave something true behind, a record carried only by the dark and the dust, and when his voice finally fell silent, the wind seemed to ease, as if even the gallows were listening, and somewhere beyond the cell walls, unseen and unaware, truth waited, one that could unravel the legend stitched so tightly around his name. If only the world were willing to hear it. They said her name softly in red mesa, as if speaking it too loud might summon death itself. And when Clara Vale rode into town dressed in black beneath the unforgiving western sun, every man watched from behind shaded windows or half-closed doors, because stories traveled faster than horses in the desert, and Clara's story had already arrived long before she did, whispered in saloons and muttered at card tables, that she was a widow not once but 3 times over, that every outlaw who had ever loved her had met a violent end, that she carried grief like a shadow and bad luck like a perfume, though none of them knew how young she was beneath the veil, or how tired her eyes had become from burying men she once believed would outrun their fates, and Clara herself said nothing as she settled into the small adobe house at the edge of town, the one no one else wanted because the wind howled too loudly there at night, because silence had long ago taught her that explanations only fed fear, and fear, once planted, grew wild. Days passed in the heat shimmer, red mesa, dry and brittle as old bone, and Clara lived quietly, tending a small garden that barely survived the dust, hanging laundry that snapped like flags of surrender, and at night she sat alone with memories that felt heavier than any coffin lid, remembering how love had once come to her easily, foolishly, before she learned that loving men who lived by the gun was like falling in love with fire, beautiful, warming, and certain to leave scars. The first had been Thomas Reed, gentle in his way, who swore he would quit outlaw life after one last ride and never did, shot down by deputies before Clara could even finish sewing the dress she planned to wear at their wedding. The second was Elias Boone, charming and reckless, who believed fate favored the bold until a rival's bullet proved otherwise, and the third, Matthew Hale, had lasted the longest, had almost convinced her the curse was only coincidence, until he too bled out beneath a pale desert moon, whispering apologies into her trembling hands, and by the time Clara buried him she no longer cried the way she once had, grief settling into her bones like an old ache that flared without warning. Red Mesa watched her carefully, measuring distance as if tragedy might be contagious, and Clara accepted the isolation because she believed it was safer that way, because loneliness hurt less than loving and losing again. But fate, cruel and patient, had other plans, and one late afternoon when the heat lay heavy and the cicadas sang like restless ghosts, a man collapsed at her doorstep, his body hitting the dirt with a dull sound that made Clara freeze mid-step, and when she knelt beside him she saw the blood first, dark against the dust, seeping through his torn shirt near the ribs, his face drawn tight with pain but still striking in a worn, weathered way, the face of a man who had lived hard and expected no mercy. And for a long moment Clara considered closing the door, letting the town deal with him, because she knew better than anyone what wounded gunslingers brought with them. But something in his breathing, shallow and stubborn, reminded her of too many dying men she had loved, and before fear could stop her she dragged him inside, her hand steady though her heart raced, and laid him on the narrow bed, cleaning the wound with practiced care she never wanted to need again. The man drifted in and out of consciousness through the long night, murmuring half-formed words, names she did not recognize, regrets that clung to the air like smoke, and when dawn came pale and quiet, he opened his eyes and looked at her as if she were a miracle he didn't believe he deserved, and he told her his name was Luke Calder, a gunslinger passing through, though the way he said it carried weight, as if the name had been spoken with fear before, and Clara nodded, offering water but not questions, because she had learned questions only led to answers that hurt. And as days passed Luke healed slowly, the town growing restless with his presence, watching Clara's house with renewed suspicion, whispering that the curse had found a new victim, and Clara felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the warning she had ignored too many times before. Yet despite herself she listened to Luke when he spoke, his voice low and careful, telling stories not of glory but of roads taken too fast and choices made too young. And there was something different about him, a gentleness beneath the scars, a sadness that matched her own, and they shared quiet moments in the evenings, sitting apart but close enough to feel each other's warmth, speaking of simple things like rain that never came and places neither of them had stayed long enough to call home. And Clara hated herself for noticing the way his smile softened when he looked at her, hated herself more for returning it, because love, she believed, was a promise the world had never kept for her. Luke, for his part, noticed the way Clara flinched whenever he moved too suddenly, the way she avoided touching him unless necessary, and he understood without her saying a word that she carried more ghosts than furniture in that small house, and one night as the desert cooled and the stars burned sharp above them, he told her he planned to leave as soon as he could ride, not because he wanted to but because he could feel the eyes on the house, could sense trouble circling like a vulture waiting for weakness, and Clara felt a familiar hollow open inside her chest, the beginning of an ending she recognized all too well, and though she nodded and said it was best, her hands trembled when she turned away, and Luke saw it, reaching out but stopping himself, because some lines, once crossed, could never be erased. Red Mesa's fear finally found a voice in the sheriff, who came one morning with a warning thinly disguised as concern, telling Clara the town wouldn't tolerate another outlaw dying under her roof, that people were starting to talk, and Clara listened quietly, her face calm, because she had learned that anger only fed men like him, and when he left she stood alone in the doorway, the weight of the past pressing hard, knowing that no matter what she did the story would end the same way, because it always did, and when Luke finally saddled his horse days later, still weak but determined, Clara stood beside him beneath the harsh sun, their farewell heavy with words neither dared speak, and Luke confessed then, softly, that he believed the stories about her were wrong, that death followed him, not her, and Clara almost laughed at the cruel symmetry of it, two people each convinced they were the danger, and as he rode away dust trailing behind him like a fading memory, Clara felt the ache settle deep, the familiar grief that came not from loss but from loving too late, too carefully, and she did not know then that fate had only begun to weave their story, that the desert had a way of drawing back what it let go, and that love, once awakened, did not die easily, even in a town that feared her name. Deadwood Crossing lay stretched beneath a hard, colorless sky like a place the world had forgotten on purpose, its buildings leaning at tired angles, its main street scarred by old wagon ruts and newer bullet holes, and no one there talked about Law anymore because Law had left years ago in a pine box, carried out after sunset while the town pretended not to watch, and so when a lone rider appeared on the southern road one dry afternoon, most folks barely lifted their eyes, assuming he was just another drifter passing through or another doomed fool who didn't know better. Yet the man on the horse rode slowly, deliberately, as if every step forward carried weight, his shoulders slumped not with age but with memory, his coat dusty and worn, and pinned to it, half hidden beneath the lapel, was a tarnished marshal's badge that caught the light just long enough for a few sharp-eyed souls to notice and feel an old, uneasy stirring in their chests. His name was Silas Harlan, though few in Deadwood Crossing remembered it, and fewer still would have spoken it kindly, because Silas was the marshal who had failed them, the one who had sworn to protect the town years ago and watched it burn instead. And as he rode past the saloon with its broken windows and the general store with its sagging porch, the ghosts rode with him, louder than the creak of his saddle or the clop of hooves on dry earth, ghosts of a night when the Blackthorn gang came riding in like a storm, 6 men hungry for blood and coin, and Silas, younger then, had tried to stand alone, had tried to hold the line while waiting for help that never came, and by dawn the gang was gone, along with half the town's savings and 3 good people buried behind the church, including Silas's wife, Anna, who had bled out on the saloon floor while he fought outside, her last look not angry or accusing, but quietly broken, as if she already knew the cost of loving a man who believed too much in duty. Silas had left Deadwood Crossing after that, leaving his badge behind like a piece of his own skin, wandering from town to town doing work that didn't require promises, telling himself he was done with law, done with choosing who lived and who died. Yet years later, standing at the edge of Deadwood Crossing again, he felt the familiar pull of unfinished things, because word had reached him on the trail that the Blackthorn gang was coming back, older, meaner, and intent on finishing what they started, and Silas knew then that running had never freed him. It had only delayed this moment. He dismounted near the old jail, the door hanging crooked on rusted hinges, and pushed it open with a slow groan, dust rising like a memory disturbed, and inside he found the badge where he had left it, tucked into a cracked drawer, dulled by time but intact, and when he pinned it to his coat his hand trembled, not with fear but with the weight of everything it represented. And outside, the town watched from behind curtains and door frames, disbelief mixing with resentment, because hope was a dangerous thing in Deadwood Crossing, and they had learned to live without it. The first to speak to him was Ruth Calder, who ran the boarding house, and had buried a son the night of the raid, and she looked at Silas with eyes that had cried themselves dry years ago and said, "You've got nerve coming back," and Silas met her gaze and answered simply, "I know," because excuses meant nothing now, and slowly, reluctantly, the town gathered, drawn by curiosity or anger or the faint, stubborn spark of something they pretended not to feel, and Silas told them the truth without softness, that the Blackthorn gang was riding hard and would reach Deadwood Crossing within days, that they would take what little was left and kill anyone who resisted, and that he did not ask forgiveness or trust, only time. And the room buzzed with bitter laughter and disbelief, men shaking their heads, women crossing their arms, because they had heard brave words before and buried the results, and one man spat on the floor and said, "You couldn't save us then," and Silas nodded again, the motion heavy. "I know," he repeated, "but I'm here now," and that was all he offered, no speeches about redemption or honor, just presence, just a man willing to stand where others would run. Preparations began in uneasy silence, windows boarded, old rifles cleaned, and Silas moved through the town like a shadow, organizing what little defense they could manage, assigning positions, checking sightlines, speaking quietly to people who had once looked to him with faith and now looked with guarded doubt, and at night he slept in the jail, staring at the ceiling while memories played without mercy, hearing Anna's voice in the creak of the beams, seeing her smile in the flicker of lantern light, and the guilt pressed down until breathing felt like work. But each morning he rose and pinned on the badge again, because courage, he had learned too late, was not the absence of fear but the decision to carry it anyway. The day before the gang was due, a young boy named Eli approached him, no more than 15. Holding an old revolver with shaking hands, asking where he should stand, and Silas saw himself in the boy, saw the hunger to be useful, to matter, and gently took the gun away, telling him his job was to run messages and keep his head down, and the disappointment in Eli's eyes cut deeper than any insult, because Silas knew how badly boys wanted to prove themselves, and how quickly the ground swallowed them when they tried. And when the sun finally rose on the day of reckoning, the air felt tight and brittle, birds gone silent, dust hanging low as if the land itself was bracing, and when the Blackthorn gang appeared at the far end of the road, 6 riders spread wide, confidence rolling off them like heat, Silas stepped into the street alone, the badge catching the light, and for a moment time stretched thin, memories of the last stand overlaying the present until he felt almost dizzy, and the gang leader, a man with iron-gray hair and a scarred grin, laughed when he recognized Silas, calling out, "Thought you'd learn better," and Silas answered with a calm he did not feel, telling him this town was closed, that they would turn back or be buried here, and the laughter that followed was sharp and cruel. But when the first shot rang out, it was Silas who fired, not to kill but to draw attention, and the street erupted into chaos, gunfire cracking, windows shattering, screams cutting through the smoke, and Silas moved with a focus born of regret, placing himself where the fire was hottest, drawing the gang's attention away from the town, taking hits that would have dropped a lesser man, his shoulder burning, his leg screaming, but still he stood, because this time he would not run, and as one of the gang fell and another retreated, Silas caught sight of Eli darting between buildings, doing exactly as told, alive, and something loosened in his chest, because maybe this time the story would end differently. The fight felt endless, each second stretching like a lifetime, until finally the street fell quiet, dust settling, the remaining gang members fleeing into the open land, leaving their dead behind, and Silas collapsed to one knee, blood soaking his coat, the badge heavy against his heart, and as townsfolk emerged slowly, disbelief giving way to something fragile and trembling, Ruth called and knelt beside him, pressing cloth to his wounds, and for the first time since his return, no one looked at him with blame, only with the stunned recognition that he had stayed, that he had faced the ghosts instead of running. And as Silas lay there beneath the wide, indifferent sky, pain-sharp but grounding, he felt Anna's memory not as accusation but as quiet presence, and though he knew the road ahead would still be long and lonely, he also knew that Deadwood Crossing had law again, not because the badge said so, but because someone had finally been willing to stand and pay the price. And as dusk settled and lanterns were lit, Silas Harlan, the last marshal of Deadwood Crossing, closed his eyes knowing that whatever came next, he had not failed this time, even if the cost was everything he had left. Black Canyon cut through the land like an old wound that never healed, its jagged walls swallowing sunlight and sound alike, and every soul within 100 miles knew better than to wander too close, because stories clung to that place the way shadows clung to stone, stories of a gold vein so rich it gleamed like fire in the dark, and so cursed that no man who sought it ever returned the same, if he returned at all. And it was into this silence that Aaron Pike rode one fading afternoon, thin as hunger and worn down by years of bad luck, his mule limping, his canteen nearly dry, and in his coat pocket a folded map he had found tucked inside a dead man's Bible at a trading post, a map marked with trembling ink and a single warning written in a hand that looked half mad. Gold buys nothing it doesn't take back, yet desperation has a way of dulling fear. And Aaron, who had lost his farm to drought and his wife to sickness and his pride to the slow cruelty of surviving, believed he had nothing left to lose. The first whisper came at dusk, so soft he thought it was the wind curling through the canyon walls, a low murmur that seemed to know his name, and Aaron shook his head and pressed on, telling himself the desert played tricks on lonely men. But as night fell and the stars burned sharp above the narrow strip of sky, the voices grew clearer, not loud, not threatening, but intimate, promising relief, promising rest, promising that the gold ahead would end the ache that had lived in his bones for years, and Aaron found himself answering them without realizing it, muttering back into the dark as if confiding in an unseen companion. By morning he reached the narrow pass marked on the map, the stone there blackened and smooth as if burned long ago, and when he climbed down into the canyon floor, the air felt colder, heavier, carrying the smell of damp earth and something older, something like iron and regret, and the voices followed him. Still, guiding his steps, urging him onward, until he found it, the vein running through the rock face like a living thing, gold so bright it seemed to glow on its own, and Aaron fell to his knees laughing and crying all at once, his hands shaking as he touched it, because for the first time since the world had turned against him, he felt chosen. He worked until his palms blistered and his back screamed, tearing chunks of ore free and stuffing them into his pack, and with every strike the whispers grew warmer, more approving, telling him he was wise, telling him he deserved this, telling him that suffering had been a test and this was the reward, and when exhaustion finally forced him to stop, he slept beside the vein like a lover guarding a secret, dreaming not of gold but of his wife's face, healthy and smiling as she once had, calling his name from somewhere just beyond reach. When he woke, the voices were different, closer, sharper, asking what he was willing to give to keep what he had found, and Aaron laughed nervously, telling them he had already given everything, but the canyon answered with silence so deep it rang, and as he climbed out with his heavy pack the wall seemed to lean inward, the path behind him subtly changed, turns not matching his memory or the map, and the first sign of the price came when he reached his mule and found it dead, eyes wide, no wound visible, as if fear itself had stopped its heart, and Aaron felt a flicker of dread then, but he slung the pack over his own shoulders and began the long walk back, telling himself animals died in the desert all the time. The whispers followed him into the open land, no longer confined to the canyon, and now they spoke of debts, of balance, of how nothing taken from Black Canyon stayed unpaid, and Aaron's steps grew slower as the weight of the gold seemed to increase with every mile, his shoulders aching, his breath ragged, and when he tried to drop the pack his hands refused to open, fingers locked tight as if the gold had claimed him as much as he had claimed it. Nights grew colder, the stars harsher, and Aaron began to see things at the edge of his vision, figures watching from distant ridges, shapes that vanished when he turned his head, and the voices reminded him gently that he was not alone, that Black Canyon never truly let go, and on the third day he came upon a small camp where a woman named Lila Hart lived alone, tending goats and selling cheese to passing traders, and when she saw Aaron stumble toward her, hollow-eyed and shaking, she brought him water and listened as he tried to explain, though he spoke little of the gold, only that something followed him, something that would not let him rest, and Lila, who had buried a husband lost to his own greed years before, looked at the pack and seemed to understand without being told, warning him that some fortunes were only bait, and Aaron felt a flash of anger then, sharp and ugly, accusing her of jealousy, of wanting what was his, and the voices swelled in approval, urging him to leave before she could take what he had earned. He staggered away at dawn, ignoring the way Lila watched him go with quiet sorrow, and as the days blurred together Aaron's body weakened but his grip on the gold tightened, the voices now demanding proof of loyalty, small things at first, like refusing water to another traveler, like walking past a dying man without stopping, and each time he obeyed, a strange warmth filled him, easing the pain for a moment, convincing him he was doing what was necessary, until necessity and cruelty became impossible to separate. The terrible price revealed itself fully when Aaron finally reached the outskirts of a mining town, his clothes torn, his face drawn and wild, and collapsed in the dirt just beyond the first building, townsfolk rushing out to help until they saw his eyes, dark and distant, and the way he clutched the pack as if it were part of him, and when they pried it free his fingers cracked and bled, and the whispers screamed then, not in rage but in triumph, because the moment the gold left his hands, Aaron Pike went quiet, his body still warm but his gaze empty, as if whatever had animated him had slipped back into the earth. The townsfolk found the gold inside, enough to make men gasp and dreams ignite. But when they tried to move it, a deep unease settled over them, the air growing cold, the shadows lengthening despite the sun, and an old prospector crossed himself and said it was devil's gold, and by nightfall the ore was buried far from town, the grave marked with no stone, and Aaron Pike was laid to rest beside it, his name spoken once and then not at all, because some lessons were learned only by watching another man fall. Long after, travelers passing near Black Canyon swore they heard whispers on the wind, voices promising salvation to the desperate and broken, and sometimes, if the light was just right, they claimed to see a lone figure walking the ridge at dusk, shoulders bent beneath an invisible weight, forever carrying what he should have left behind, a reminder etched into the land itself that the Wild West did not need devils to damn a man, only desire, and the belief that gold could fill what grief had hollowed out.